Imagine if all of human history were compressed into a single 24-hour day. The first humans appear at midnight. For the next 23 hours and 59 minutes, they're making stone tools, hunting, gathering, moving across continents, surviving ice ages. Then, in the final minute before midnight, everything explodes. Cities appear, writing is invented, pyramids rise, empires spread across continents, and in the last few seconds, we go from horse-drawn carriages to landing on the moon. That's the story of our species compressed into a day, and it raises one of the most profound questions in all of human history. Why did it take so long? Anatomically modern humans, people who looked just like us, with brains the same size as ours, existed for roughly 250,000 years before anyone built a city, planted a field, or scratched the first written word into clay. 250,000 years. That's not a gap in the historical record. That's not missing evidence. That's the actual timeline. For 250,000 years, humans lived in small groups, moving with the seasons, using stone tools that barely change for thousands of generations. Now, let's be clear. The title of this script says, "We did nothing," and that's deliberately provocative. It's not literally true. Our ancestors were surviving, adapting, developing language, creating art, building complex social structures. They were doing the incredibly difficult work of being human in a world that was constantly trying to kill them. But compared to what came later, compared to the explosive acceleration of the last 10,000 years, the pace of change was almost imperceptibly slow. Think about it. The same basic stone hand axes were being made, barely modified, for over 1,000,000 years. 1,000,000 years. Meanwhile, in the last century alone, we went from the Wright brothers to SpaceX, from telegraphs to smartphones, from figuring out how flight works to sending robots to Mars. What changed? Why did everything happen at once after such an incredibly long silence? That's the mystery we're going to explore. We're going to walk through the entire arc of human history, from those desperate survivors hanging on by a thread 900,000 years ago, through the long, slow accumulation of skills and knowledge, to the moment when everything suddenly accelerated. We'll see how climate shaped us, how migration transformed us, how art and language rewired our minds, and how a few crucial inventions triggered a cascade that's still accelerating today. If you're curious about diving even deeper into these prehistoric mysteries, there's a book exploring the hidden secrets of our earliest ancestors, available at sleepytimehistory.com. But for now, let's start at the beginning. Or rather, let's start after the beginning, after the bottleneck, after the near extinction, in the long, mysterious silence that followed. Africa, 300,000 years ago. Picture a landscape that would seem both familiar and completely alien to modern eyes. Savannas stretched to horizons, but these weren't the carefully managed grasslands you might see in a nature documentary. These were wild places, swinging between lush abundance and deadly drought, with brutal unpredictability. Massive herds moved across the plains, not just antelope and zebra, but creatures that would dwarf anything alive today. Elephants 3 times the size of modern species. Giant buffalo with horn spans wider than a man is tall. Hippos as big as rhinos. And hunting them, giant hyenas, saber-toothed cats and leopards powerful enough to drag a full-grown human up a tree like a house cat carrying a mouse. Somewhere in this dangerous world, small groups of your ancestors were trying to stay alive. Maybe 20 people, maybe 50. Never more than a few dozen together for long, because the landscape couldn't support large concentrations. They moved constantly, following water, tracking animal migrations, remembering where certain plants fruited in certain seasons. Their daily existence was a grinding struggle against hunger, predators, disease, and the constant threat of climate collapse. When the rains failed, which happened regularly, Entire regions could become uninhabitable within a generation. Groups that couldn't migrate fast enough simply vanished. The fossil record shows us these disappearances, clusters of human sites that suddenly go silent, empty territories that wouldn't be reoccupied for thousands of years. They had fire, they had stone tools, carefully crafted hand axes and scrapers that required genuine skill to produce. They had complex social bonds, language of some kind, though we can only guess at how sophisticated it was. They cared for their injured and elderly, evidence that they possessed empathy and abstract reasoning about future needs. And here's the thing that makes archaeologists lie awake at night. They had brains. Not smaller brains, not simpler brains. Brains essentially identical to yours. If you could somehow raise a child from 250,000 years ago in a modern family, they would learn to read, do calculus, argue about politics, create art, fall in love, everything you can do. The hardware was already there, fully developed, ready. So why weren't they doing those things? Why did their toolkit remain basically unchanged for tens of thousands of years? Why didn't they plant crops when they must have noticed that seeds grew into plants? Why didn't they build permanent settlements when they clearly understood construction? They built temporary shelters constantly. Why didn't they develop writing when they were certainly capable of symbolic thinking? Anthropologists call this the behavioral modernity problem. You have people who are biologically modern, cognitively capable of everything we do today, but behaving in ways that seem almost frozen in time. Some researchers argue that behavioral modernity emerged gradually, that each generation added tiny innovations that eventually accumulated into the cultural explosion we see later. Others think something dramatic happened, some crucial innovation or insight that suddenly unlocked capabilities that had been latent all along. The truth is probably more complex than either explanation. But what we know for certain is that survival itself was consuming every ounce of human ingenuity. These weren't people doing nothing. These were people performing an extraordinary balancing act, maintaining enough population to avoid inbreeding, spreading out enough to avoid being wiped out by local disasters, but staying connected enough to share knowledge and maintain cultural continuity. And then, around 74,000 years ago, they faced a test that almost ended everything. Mount Toba in Indonesia erupted with a force that makes every volcanic disaster in recorded history look like a firecracker. The explosion ejected so much ash and sulfur into the atmosphere that it triggered a volcanic winter lasting years, maybe decades. Temperatures plummeted. In some regions, average temperatures may have dropped by 15 degrees Celsius. Growing seasons collapsed. Plants died. Animals starved. And humans, already living on the edge, were pushed to the very brink of extinction. Genetic analysis of modern populations shows the signature of this near catastrophe written in our DNA. Something reduced human genetic diversity to levels that suggest we pass through an extreme bottleneck. Some estimates put the total breeding population at as low as 3,000 to 10,000 individuals. Others suggest it might have been even smaller, a few thousand people scattered across Africa and maybe parts of Asia, clinging to whatever refuges they could find. Most groups probably didn't make it. The fossil record from this period is sparse, but what little evidence we have suggests massive population crashes across multiple regions. Only the luckiest, the most adaptable, the ones who happened to be in the right place with the right knowledge survived. But survive they did. And when the volcanic winter finally ended, when the climate began to stabilize again, those survivors carried with them something precious. Not just genes, but knowledge, hard-won understanding of how to endure when the world turns hostile, social structures capable of maintaining cooperation under impossible pressure, and perhaps burned into their collective memory a desperate determination to never be that vulnerable again. What happened next would change everything. But first there were sparks in the darkness, the earliest signs that human consciousness was beginning to turn inward, beginning to ask not just how to survive, but why. Southern Africa, 77,000 years ago. Your ancestors have just endured the Toba catastrophe. They've survived the volcanic winter, watched populations collapse around them, clung to life in whatever refuges offered enough food and water to keep breathing. The world is slowly warming again, slowly becoming livable. And in a cave overlooking the Indian Ocean, someone picks up a piece of red ochre and starts scratching lines into it. Not randomly, not accidentally, deliberately, carefully, creating a geometric pattern, cross-hatched lines forming diamonds. Then they set it down and walk away, leaving behind what might be the oldest abstract design ever created by human hands. This is the Blombos cave engraving, and it represents something more profound than you might think. This isn't a tool. It isn't helping anyone hunt better or process food more efficiently. It serves no immediate survival function. It's just a pattern, lines on a rock. But those lines mean someone was thinking symbolically, abstractly, creating meaning where none existed before. They were making art. Around the same time, other people at Blombos were doing something equally strange. They were drilling tiny holes in seashells, stringing them together, wearing them as jewellery. Again, no survival function. Shells don't keep you warm, don't help you kill animals, don't make food taste better. But someone decided they were important anyway, important enough to spend time and energy collecting specific shells, making identical holes in each one, threading them carefully, creating something that existed only to be seen, to communicate something about the wearer. This is symbolic behaviour, the ability to assign meaning to objects and actions beyond their immediate practical function, and it represents a kind of cognitive revolution. Because once you can think symbolically, once you can create abstract meaning, you can do almost anything. You can create art, religion, mathematics, writing. You can imagine futures that don't exist yet and make plans to bring them into being. You can tell stories about the past and use them to guide decisions in the present. The Blombos findings aren't isolated incidents. Across southern and eastern Africa, archaeological sites from roughly the same period show similar evidence of symbolic thinking. Border Cave in South Africa has yielded carefully crafted bone tools, not crude implements, but precisely shaped awls, and points that would have required planning and technical knowledge to create. More shell beads, these ones showing evidence of being worn regularly, the holes smoothed by friction from cord or sinew. Most tellingly, pigment. Lots of pigment. Red ochre, ground into powder, mixed with fat or plant resins stored in shells. People weren't just accidentally noticing that certain rocks were red. They were seeking them out, processing them, storing them for later use. But for what? Body decoration probably, though we can't be certain. Possibly ritual purposes. Maybe painting objects or surfaces that haven't survived. The point is they were doing something that required abstract thought, planning, the concept of transforming raw materials into something culturally meaningful. But here's where it gets complicated. These sparks of symbolic behaviour don't appear consistently. The archaeological record shows what looks like fits and starts, periods where symbolic artefacts appear at multiple sites, then long gaps where they seem to vanish entirely. You get sophisticated tool-making at one site dated to 90,000 years ago, then nothing similar for another 20,000 years. Shell beads appear, disappear, reappear again in slightly different forms thousands of years later. This has created intense debate among archaeologists. One camp argues these are isolated innovations, individual groups stumbling onto symbolic behaviour independently. then losing it when populations crashed or environmental conditions deteriorated. The other camp insists there must have been a sustained cultural tradition, sophisticated behaviour that was maintained continuously, but just hasn't left consistent archaeological traces because preservation conditions are difficult and our sample size is tiny. Both might be right. This period was still characterized by small, scattered populations living under enormous environmental pressure. When groups numbered only dozens of individuals, when survival required constant movement and adaptation, cultural knowledge would have been incredibly fragile. Lose a few key individuals, the ones who remembered how to make a particular tool or perform a particular ritual, and that knowledge could vanish entirely. Anthropologists call this the cultural ratchet problem. In large populations, innovations accumulate like a ratchet mechanism, each generation building on what came before, knowledge rarely lost because so many people carry it. But in small populations, the ratchet can slip backward. Knowledge gets lost. Skills disappear. Each generation has to partially reinvent what their great-grandparents knew. Your ancestors might have been caught in this trap for tens of thousands of years, developing symbolic thinking, creating art and ritual and complex cultural practices, then losing it all when populations crashed during climate downturns, only to redevelop similar practices again when conditions improved. An agonizing cycle of cultural birth and death, repeated across millennia. But there's another piece of evidence that suggests something deeper was happening. Burial practices. Not elaborate graves, not yet, but intentional placement of bodies in certain locations, occasionally with objects. Border Cave has what might be the oldest known burial of an infant, carefully placed in a small grave with a perforated shell. Whether this represents belief in an afterlife is impossible to know, but it suggests at minimum that death was understood as something significant, something worthy of ritual attention. Think about what that means. To bury someone intentionally, you need to conceive of death as more than just biological cessation. You need to understand that the person who existed is somehow still important even though they're gone. You need abstract concepts like memory, identity, perhaps even spirit or soul. You're thinking about things that can't be directly observed, that exist only in consciousness. This is symbolic thought at its most fundamental, not just making marks on rocks or wearing decorative shells, but grappling with the deepest questions of existence. Who are we? What happens when we die? Do we continue somehow? These aren't practical survival questions. These are philosophical questions, spiritual questions, the kind of questions that would eventually generate religion, art, literature, everything that makes human culture distinct. The sparks were there, flickering in the darkness, sometimes bright, sometimes barely visible, but growing stronger, becoming more frequent, building towards something unprecedented. Because once humans started thinking symbolically, started asking questions that had no immediate survival value, they'd crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. They were becoming something more than just another clever primate trying to survive. They were becoming conscious of themselves, aware of their own awareness, and that changed everything. Around 70,000 years ago, something changed. Not suddenly, not everywhere at once. But across Africa, human populations that had been maintaining a precarious balance for tens of thousands of years began to move. Not just the usual seasonal migrations following game or water. Something bigger. Something that would ultimately carry their descendants to every habitable corner of the planet. Nobody knows exactly what triggered it. The climate was improving after the Toba catastrophe. That much is clear. East Africa was becoming wetter, grasslands expanding, animal populations were recovering. Maybe it was simple population pressure. More people meant more competition for the same territories, pushing groups outward towards less contested regions. Maybe it was following game herds that were themselves expanding into new territories as conditions improved. Maybe it was just curiosity, that uniquely human compulsion to see what's on the other side of the next hill, the next valley, the next horizon. Or maybe it was all of these things combined. Because human decisions are rarely simple. They're shaped by necessity, opportunity, and sometimes just the accumulated momentum of small choices over multiple generations. One generation moves 50 miles north following better hunting. The next generation does the same. A few centuries later, their descendants are in completely different continents, barely remembering there was ever anywhere else. What we know is that small groups began leaving Africa through multiple routes. Some crossed the narrow strait at the southern end of the Red Sea, maybe during a period of low sea level when the crossing was easier. Others moved through the Sinai Peninsula into the Middle East. These weren't mass exoduses, probably just a few hundred individuals in each wave, small bands deciding the resources were better elsewhere, the future more promising beyond familiar territories. The most successful route appears to have been coastal, following the shoreline of the Arabian Peninsula, then eastward along the Indian Ocean rim. This makes sense. Coastlines provide reliable resources even when inland areas are harsh and unpredictable. Shellfish, fish, seabirds, marine mammals. Populations following this coastal highway could move surprisingly fast without needing to develop entirely new survival strategies, and they moved fast. Archaeological evidence suggests humans reached Southeast Asia by 70,000 years ago, maybe earlier. More remarkably, they reached Australia by around 65,000 years ago. Think about what that means. Australia has been separated from mainland Asia by deep ocean channels for millions of years. There's no way to reach it by accident. You can't just follow a land bridge or stumble onto it during seasonal movements. To reach Australia, your ancestors needed boats. Real boats, capable of carrying people, supplies, and enough fresh water to survive journeys of perhaps 50 or 60 miles across open ocean. They needed navigation skills, understanding of currents and weather. They needed planning, coordination, the ability to organize group efforts toward distant goals. This wasn't primitive wandering. This was sophisticated maritime technology, developed and executed by people who supposedly hadn't yet created civilization. But here's where the story gets really complicated, because as these modern human populations spread across Eurasia, they weren't entering empty territory. Other human species were already there. Neanderthals had been living in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. Denisovans occupied large parts of Asia. These were the descendants of earlier human migrations, populations that had left Africa much earlier and adapted to their new environments over countless generations. What happened when they met? We have genetic evidence. Clear proof that modern humans and Neanderthals interbred, probably multiple times over tens of thousands of years. Modern non-African populations carry roughly 2% Neanderthal DNA. Traces of ancient encounters that happened so long ago, they're now just faint signals in our chromosomes. Similar evidence shows interbreeding with Denisovans, particularly in Asian and Melanesian populations. But genetics only tells us that interbreeding happened. It doesn't tell us what those encounters actually looked like. Did our ancestors and Neanderthals recognize each other as different species, or just as other groups of people, different but not fundamentally alien? The fact that they could produce viable offspring together suggests they were still closely related, still genetically compatible despite hundreds of thousands of years of separate evolution. Maybe it was trade. Archaeological sites in the Middle East show mixed tool technologies, Neanderthal techniques appearing in modern human sites and vice versa. Knowledge was being shared somehow, maybe through friendly contact, exchange of goods and information between groups that encountered each other at resource-rich locations, maybe through intermarriage, individuals moving between communities, carrying their knowledge with them, or maybe it was conflict. competition for the same caves, the same hunting territories, the same water sources. Modern humans arriving in regions where Neanderthals had lived successfully for millennia, bringing new hunting strategies and potentially larger group sizes. Violence would have been inevitable sometimes, and maybe some of that violence included what we would now call warfare, organised group conflicts over resources. Or maybe, most likely, it was all of these things. Sometimes cooperation, sometimes conflict, sometimes peaceful coexistence, groups living near each other for generations without much interaction, sometimes intense engagement, trade and interbreeding and cultural exchange. Human relationships are never simple, even with our own species. Relations between species would have been vastly more complex. What's remarkable is that despite spreading across 3 continents over 40,000 years, despite encountering and interbreeding with other human species, despite adapting to environments ranging from tropical rainforest to frozen tundra, the pace of technological change remained extraordinarily slow. Tools from 60,000 years ago look quite similar to tools from 30,000 years ago. Hunting strategies seem largely unchanged. Living arrangements, social structures, the basic pattern of life apparently stayed relatively constant for tens of thousands of years. Your ancestors were spreading across the world, yes. Adapting to new environments, yes. Encountering wonders and dangers that would have seemed impossible to their African relatives. But they weren't yet transforming the world. They weren't yet the unstoppable force that would eventually dominate every ecosystem they entered. They were still just another species trying to survive, still part of nature rather than separate from it, still living within ecological limits rather than constantly pushing past them. The explosion was coming. But for now, they were simply spreading, slowly, cautiously, into a world that was vast and dangerous, and filled with other humans who had their own ancient claims to the land. The real transformation was still thousands of years away, waiting for the right combination of circumstances, innovations and population pressures to ignite something unprecedented. By the time your ancestors reached the far edges of Eurasia, the world itself had become a kind of alien planet. Ice sheets a mile thick smothered much of northern Europe and Siberia. Glaciers ground slowly across the landscape, carving valleys, redirecting rivers, leaving behind endless fields of shattered rock. South of the ice, a different world spread out. Cold, dry grasslands stretching from France to Mongolia. Biologists call it the Mammoth Steppe. Imagine a rolling tundra prairie, treeless for miles under a pale sky. Long winters, short summers. But strangely, it was rich. Herds of mammoths moved slowly across the plains, grazing on tough grasses and sedges. Woolly rhinoceroses, their horns sweeping low over the ground. Giant elk, their antlers wider than a person is tall. Wild horses, bison, reindeer. Predators followed them. Cave lions, hyenas, saber-toothed relatives, packs of wolves. This was a world of giants, adapted to cold and scarcity, constantly moving to stay ahead of the seasons. Into this harsh, glittering landscape walked your ancestors, wrapped in animal skins, carrying spears, following the herds. To them, the ice at the horizon was as permanent as the mountains. The seasons swung from brutal to merely difficult. Every day was a negotiation with cold, hunger, and danger. For tens of thousands of years after leaving Africa, their basic way of life changed only slowly. New regions, yes. New prey, new enemies, yes. But the tools, the strategies, the social patterns looked familiar. Stone blades, wooden spears, fire, small bands. The long human silence continued. And then, somewhere around 50,000 to 40,000 years ago, something began to shift. Archaeologists call this period the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. It doesn't look like a single sudden event. more like a phase change. Ice still covered the north, mammoths still walked the plains. But in scattered sites from Africa to Europe to Asia, the archaeological record starts to look different, denser, busier, more human. Stone tools become more specialized. Instead of a few basic shapes, entire toolkits appear. Delicate blades for cutting hides, scrapers for working bone, tiny points for piercing. People begin using new materials in systematic ways. Bone and antler, once mostly waste, become raw materials shaped into needles with tiny drilled eyes. Fishing hooks, some gourd-shaped, some curved, appear along coasts and rivers. These aren't emergency improvisations. They're tools built for specific tasks, refined over generations. Weaponry changes too. Simple thrusting spears give way to composite systems. Spear throwers, atlatls, begin to show up, carved levers that extend the arm, turning a human throw into something far more powerful, launching spears at lethal speeds and distances. Later, in some regions, the first hints of bows and arrows appear. Hunting is becoming more efficient, more planned, more technological. It's as if the human mind suddenly finds new gears. The same basic brain, the same hands, but a different way of thinking about possibilities. Objects are no longer just sharp or blunt. They're components in systems, points, shafts, bindings, adhesives, each part made somewhere by someone, according to shared ideas of how things should look and function. And then, deep underground, another kind of revolution leaves its mark. In southern France, in a cave now called Chauvet, people walk into the darkness around 36,000 years ago. They bring fire, torches, lamps burning animal fat, and they bring something else. Images in their heads they want to put on stone. On those pale walls they paint lions, rhinoceroses, horses, aurochs. Not as stick figures, but with shading, perspective, motion. Multiple heads suggesting movement. Lines tracing the arc of running animals. Some of the oldest paintings we know are already astonishingly sophisticated, as if no one eased into art gradually. It appears fully formed, like a language that's been evolving in spoken form for ages and suddenly discovers writing. Later, in Lascaux and Altamira, the tradition continues. Vast halls covered in horses and bison, deer and bulls, layered over centuries. Pigments carefully ground, surfaces prepared. Some figures use the bulges of the cave wall to suggest muscle and volume. These were not idle doodles. They took time, planning, resources and light in a world where fuel was precious. What did these paintings mean? No one knows for sure. There are theories. Maybe they were part of hunting rituals, attempts to influence the animals they depended on. Maybe they were spiritual, visions of a world behind the visible one, shamans recording journeys into trance states. Maybe they were teaching tools, ways to show young hunters how animals moved, where to strike. Or maybe they were all of these at once, ritual, instruction, memory and beauty woven together. What's striking is the emotional impact they still have. Even now, reproductions can feel uncanny. The confidence of the lines, the sense of presence. Across tens of thousands of years, you can almost feel someone's hand move. Imagine the quiet breathing in the flicker of torchlight. Whatever else these paintings were, they were communication. Across space, across generations, and now across ages. Art wasn't confined to caves. It became portable, personal. All across Ice Age Europe, from France to Russia, small carved figures begin to appear. Many of them are what we now call Venus figurines, stylized female forms, often with exaggerated breasts, hips and bellies. Their faces are usually featureless, their arms sometimes barely indicated. They were carved from ivory, stone, even baked clay, and they show up over an enormous geographic range, spanning thousands of miles and thousands of years. Why? One possibility is that they were fertility symbols, connected to pregnancy and birth in a world where infant survival was never guaranteed. Another is that they represented goddesses or spirits or ancestral mothers, nodes in a shared mythological network that travelled with migrating groups. Or perhaps they were personal charms, carried in pouches, exchanged as gifts, tokens of alliances or marriage ties. Whatever their purpose, their spread suggests that people weren't just exchanging stone and bone. They were exchanging ideas, symbols, stories. You don't get a shared artistic tradition over half a continent without some kind of common imaginative world. Other pieces of portable art tell similar stories. Engraved bone plaques with abstract patterns, pendants carved from animal teeth, beads made from shells carried far inland, hundreds of miles from any ocean. These objects don't feed you or keep you warm. They do something else. They signal identity, group membership, status, group. Relationships that exist in minds as much as in physical space. Behind all of this, behind the tools, the paintings, the figurines, lurks something even more elusive: language. Modern human language doesn't fossilize. There's no moment in the archaeological record where someone carves the words we now speak fluently. But the Upper Paleolithic world is saturated with indirect evidence that something like fully modern language must have been in place. Standardized tools imply complex teaching. You have to explain shapes, sequences, techniques. Long-distance trade networks imply negotiation, promises, perhaps even contracts remembered only in speech. Coordinated hunts with advanced weapons require planning, roles, timing, strategy. Ritual art suggests shared myths and symbolic systems that must be transmitted in narrative form. Some researchers think the basic capacity for language, syntax, large vocabularies, flexible grammar, was already present before this explosion, maybe even before humans left Africa. Under that view, what we see around 50,000 years ago is not the birth of language, but what happens when an already powerful communication system meets the right ecological and social conditions. Others propose that certain key refinements, like complex recursion, the ability to embed thoughts within thoughts, clauses within clauses, were still crystallizing during this period, giving human communication a new depth. The truth is uncertain. But it's hard to imagine Chauvet, Lascaux, or the intricate production of spear throwers and needles without people who could talk very much like we do, who could argue, persuade, gossip, dream aloud, tell stories about ancestors and spirits and the great hunt that went wrong 3 winters ago. Language didn't just describe the world, it allowed humans to build second worlds inside their heads. Shared imaginary landscapes, mythologies, kinship systems, moral codes. Once those inner worlds were detailed enough, art and ritual became almost inevitable. Religion in a broad sense may just be what happens when language and imagination turn inward and then are projected outward again in paint, stone, and song. There's another piece to this puzzle: numbers. For most of human history, our species was rare. Tiny scattered bands, often separated by hundreds of miles. Under those conditions, even brilliant ideas can vanish. A clever hunter invents a new trap. It works. But she dies in an epidemic, or her band starves in a bad winter, and the trick is gone. Innovation is fragile when there are few people to carry it. Many anthropologists think that during the Upper Paleolithic, population densities in certain regions finally crossed a critical threshold. Not huge populations by modern standards, still only tens of thousands across enormous areas, but enough that ideas could be passed on reliably. Enough that if one group died out, neighbours could preserve their techniques. Enough that specialists could emerge. Individuals particularly skilled at tool-making, healing, ritual, navigation, whose knowledge became valued and taught. In other words, culture itself became more robust. Not just a thin layer that could be scraped away by famine or disease, but a thick web of shared practices, stories, and technologies. Once that web reached a certain complexity, it began to do something unprecedented. It started evolving faster than genes. A new hunting method could spread across a continent in a few generations, far outpacing any biological adaptation. A new artistic style could be copied, modified, reinterpreted as it travelled along social networks. Language, art, tools, and growing population density formed a feedback loop. Better communication meant more efficient cooperation. More efficient cooperation supported more people. More people meant more ideas, more variation, more chances for breakthrough inventions, and each breakthrough made communication and cooperation even more valuable. The Ice Age world was still harsh. Winters still killed. Predators still stalked. Children still died far too often. But humans were beginning to do something no other species had ever done at this scale. They were creating a shared mental environment that could span thousands of miles and thousands of years. Beneath the glaciers, under the pale sky of the Mammoth Steppe, in the flicker of lamplight on cave walls, the long human silence was ending. The explosion had begun. The giants did not disappear all at once. For a long time it looked like the Ice Age world would simply continue. Mammoths trudging across the steppe, giant ground sloths tearing branches from trees in the Americas, enormous wombat-like diprotodons lumbering through the Australian bush, marsupial lions waiting in ambush, claws flexing, jaws built to sheer bone, titans that had survived countless glacial cycles, cold snaps, droughts, predators. They had outlasted everything until they met us. When your ancestors first stepped into Australia, around 50,000 years ago, they were entering a continent that had never known humans. The animals there had no reason to fear a clever ape with fire and distance weapons. They had never seen a spear, never watched a hunting party silently fan out across a ridge, never learned to associate that strange upright figure with death. For a while it must have felt like abundance without limits. Huge kangaroos, some as tall as a modern basketball player. Giant birds, heavier than ostriches that couldn't fly. Massive reptiles lurking in rivers. A world packed with slow, calorie-dense, poorly defended megafauna. From the perspective of a hungry human band, it was a gift. From the perspective of the megafauna, it was an invisible time bomb. A similar pattern plays out wherever Homo sapiens arrives late. In North America, when humans finally cross from Siberia, whether by land bridge, coastal route, or both, they find mammoths and mastodons roaming forests and plains, towering ground sloths, armoured glyptodons like living tanks, camels, horses, giant beavers the size of a modern black bear. South America has its own roster of giants, more ground sloths, strange trunk-nosed ungulates, saber-toothed cats, terror birds. In a geological blink, most of them are gone. Not overnight, not everywhere at once. But the pattern is eerie. Humans appear in the archaeological record. Within a few thousand years, the largest animals vanish. In Australia, about 90% of land mammals over 100 kilograms disappear. In the Americas, a similar proportion of big species go extinct roughly between 15,000 and 10,000 years ago. Why? There are two main stories scientists tell, and they've been arguing about them for decades. One is climate. The end of the last ice age was not gentle. Temperatures swung up and down, glaciers advanced and retreated, rain belts shifted, habitats that had been stable for tens of thousands of years fragmented and moved. For animals already living close to their ecological limits, this kind of turbulence could be deadly. Lose a key grazing corridor, a calving ground, a watering hole at the wrong moment, and a population might never recover. The other story is us. the overkill hypothesis. In this version, humans arrive with a package of innovations: coordinated group hunting, long-range weapons, fire management, flexible social learning, and apply it to animals that have never evolved defenses against such predators. Even low-level, sustained hunting can push slow-breeding giants into decline. Kill just a few too many young females each generation, and the population curve tilts downward. Once it starts to fall, bad years and accidents do the rest. For a long time, these two explanations were framed as either-or. Either climate did it, or humans did. Most evidence now suggests a more complicated answer. Both. Climate change sets the stage, stressing ecosystems, shrinking safe zones, making resources patchy and unpredictable. Then humans arrive, not in huge numbers, but with terrifying efficiency. They don't need to wipe out every last mammoth with spears and arrows. They just need to push already strained populations below their recovery threshold. In Australia, human arrival lines up more closely with megafaunal collapse than any specific climate event. In some parts of North America, climate swings seem to hit first, but the final disappearances track the spread of human hunting tools and butchery sites. In South America, the story is tangled but similar. Large animals hang on through previous glacial interglacial cycles, then vanish when people appear on the scene. However you apportion responsibility, the result is the same. The great bestiary of the Pleistocene thins out. The world becomes smaller, and that doesn't just change the animal lists in a textbook. It reshapes entire ecosystems. Big herbivores are like gardeners on a planetary scale. Mammoths and mastodons broke branches, knocked over trees, trampled saplings, maintained open grasslands. Giant ground sloths pruned forests, dispersing seeds in their dung. Australian megaherbivores grazed and browsed in ways that kept certain plants in check and others thriving. When they disappear, fire regimes change. Grasses grow taller and denser, then burn hotter. Forests advance into former open areas, or retreat depending on region and climate. Rivers silt up differently without giant animals churning their banks. Plants that relied on megafaunal seed dispersal decline or evolve new strategies. Predators that specialized in hunting large prey starve or switch to smaller targets, competing with humans and each other. Your ancestors had to adapt too. The loss of huge, slow animals forced shifts in human diets and strategies. Hunters targeted smaller, quicker species: deer, antelope, wild pigs, rabbits, birds, fish. Trapping and snaring became more important. Gathering intensified: nuts, roots, seeds, berries, shellfish. In some regions, people began to manage landscapes more actively with fire, burning patches to attract grazing animals or encourage certain plants. In a strange way, the very success of human hunting pushed humans further toward flexibility, toward the kind of broad-spectrum subsistence that would later underpin agriculture. While these giants were winking out, another kind of extinction was unfolding, closer to home. Neanderthals disappear from the fossil record around 40,000 years ago. Denisovans vanish sometime after, their trail fading into scattered DNA fragments in our genomes. For hundreds of thousands of years there had been multiple human species on the planet. Different faces, different builds, different regional adaptations, but all part of a loose interbreeding family. By the end of the Ice Age, only one remained. Did Homo sapiens kill them? Not necessarily in the cinematic sense. There is little evidence of continent-wide wars or deliberate extermination campaigns. Instead, the picture that emerges is subtler and in some ways more unsettling. Wherever modern humans arrive in Neanderthal territory, Neanderthal sites thin out and then vanish over a few thousand years. Their last refuges in southern Spain and perhaps pockets of the Near East flicker briefly, then go dark. With Denisovans the record is fainter, but their decline seems to track the spread of Homo sapiens through Asia. Competition is one likely driver. Modern humans may have had advantages in long-distance trade, social networking, symbolic communication, or flexible technology. Larger, more interconnected bands can share innovations quickly. If your group invents a better hunting technique, it spreads. If a Neanderthal band does, but is small and isolated, the idea may die with them. Climate variability probably played a role as well. Neanderthals were exquisitely adapted to Ice Age Europe. As conditions swung rapidly between cold and slightly milder phases, their specialized strategies may have become liabilities. Modern humans, with broader diets and more fluid social systems, could track resources more effectively. And then there's interbreeding. Genetic evidence shows that Neanderthals and modern humans had multiple episodes of contact and offspring. The same with Denisovans. Some of their genes, especially ones useful for immunity or altitude adaptation, live on in us. From this perspective, Neanderthals and Denisovans didn't vanish completely. They were partly absorbed. So were we responsible. In a narrow sense, no single band of Homo sapiens set out to eliminate another human species. In a broader sense, the rise of one highly flexible, rapidly innovating, socially dense lineage seems to have left less and less ecological room for others. For the first time in Earth's history, one animal was beginning to shape not just its local environment, but the global biosphere. Our ancestors did not know this. To them, each hunt, each burned field, each cleared patch of forest, each successful winter was a tiny, local victory. But in the aggregate, those small choices were steering the planet onto a new path. Megafauna gone or reduced to scattered refuges. Other human species faded into memory and myth, their genes braided into ours. Fire regimes altered, vegetation patterns shifting, predator-prey dynamics rewritten. Without anyone planning it, Homo sapiens had become a geological force. The Ice Age itself was ending. Around 20,000 years ago, the great continental ice sheets reached their maximum extent. Then, slowly at first and then in pulses, they began to retreat. Temperatures climbed, sea levels rose, drowning coastal plains your ancestors once walked. Glacial lakes burst their ice dams, sending torrents across continents. Forests advanced northward. Grasslands rearranged themselves. Rain belts shifted again. For humans, this upheaval was both a threat and an opening. Old hunting grounds vanished under rising seas or dense woodland. Migratory patterns changed. Rivers cut new channels. But in some valleys, something else began to happen. Wild grains grew more thickly. Herd animals congregated predictably in certain floodplains. The climate, though still variable, was trending toward a warmer, more stable state. In a few scattered regions, people started to experiment, very gently at first, with staying put. They didn't know it yet, but the age that had forged them, of ice, giants, and many humankinds, was passing. A new age was coming, in which a single species would learn to shape not just animals and landscapes, but the very cycle of food itself. The world was warming. The last mammoths were fading into the north, and in a strip of land between two great rivers, seeds were beginning to stir in human hands. Later, historians will call it the Fertile Crescent. Right after the Ice Age, it's not yet particularly fertile, it's fragile. And then the climate lurches again. Just as the great ice sheets are pulling back and the world seems to be warming into a gentler phase, something happens. Around 12,900 years ago, in a moment geologists call the Younger Dryas, the northern hemisphere flips back toward cold. Not a full return to glacial misery, but a sharp, sudden chill. Temperatures drop. In many regions, rainfall falters. Glaciers stabilize or re-advance. In the Levant, where some of your ancestors have begun to settle more heavily in a few resource-rich valleys, wild grain harvests become unreliable. The plants they've started to depend on thin out or fail some years. Herd animals shift their ranges. Imagine being one of them. For generations, your people have experimented with a new way of living. Semi-permanent camps near stands of wild barley, storage pits lined with stone, sickles with tiny flint blades, glossed and smoothed by the silica from countless cut stalks. You still hunt, still gather nuts and fruits, but the annual grain harvest has become a pillar of your year. Then, over the course of a few human lifetimes, that pillar wobbles. The old fully nomadic strategy, following herds across wide ranges, looks tempting again. Mobility is the classic human solution. When things get bad where you are, move. But in these river valleys and uplands, something new has taken root. Numbers. Sedentary or semi-sedentary groups can support more people on the same patch of land, at least when the harvest is good. The valleys are crowded now by ancient standards. Extended families have grown into villages. The nearby hills and plains already have neighbours hunting and gathering there. There isn't endless open space to move into, so instead, some groups try a different experiment. Instead of wandering to find the plants, they begin bringing the plants to them. At first, it's subtle. People gather wild seeds, as they always have, but now they spill some along the edges of camp. Maybe toss them onto disturbed soil near a hearth, or into midden heaps rich with nutrients. Over time, they notice that grain sprouts more thickly where people have churned and enriched the earth. Then, perhaps, someone presses seeds deliberately into soft ground near a stream. Small acts, almost invisible, but in the context of a cooling, drying shock like the Younger Dryas. These small acts become the difference between feast and famine. When the Younger Dryas ends around 11,700 years ago, the world slips, finally and for good, into the relatively warm, stable climate we still inhabit. Rainfall patterns in the Fertile Crescent settle into something more predictable. Seasons become, on average, gentler. Your ancestors there are perfectly positioned. They've spent 1,000 years backed into a corner, forced by climate stress and population pressure to intensify their relationship with a few key plants. Now, as temperatures rise again and growing seasons lengthen, those plants respond dramatically. Wheat and barley flourish in the newly reliable rains. Lentils and peas, already gathered from the wild for millennia, prove eager participants in this new experiment. Each harvest yields more seed, and each year more of those seeds are sown closer to camp. Gradually a quiet revolution unfolds in the hills of southeastern Anatolia and the plains of northern Syria. But before the field spread, something deeply puzzling appears on a stony ridge overlooking a valley, Göbekli Tepe. About 11,600 years ago, right at the transition out of the Younger Dryas, people here begin doing something that, according to the old story of human progress, they are not supposed to be able to do yet. They build, not huts or storage pits, not simple post circles or windbreaks, massive stone enclosures, carved T-shaped pillars weighing many tons, lifted and set in rings, animals and abstract symbols incised into their surfaces, foxes, snakes, wild boar, vultures, strange composite creatures. No farms surround this place. The people who raise these stones are still foragers, still hunting gazelle and wild aurochs, still gathering wild grain and nuts. For a long time, archaeologists thought the sequence was clear. First agriculture, then surplus, then villages, then temples. Religion and monumental architecture as luxuries of settled farming societies. Göbekli Tepe scrambles that neat ladder. Here, it looks like the order may have been reversed. First, large, complex gatherings, shared rituals, the labour of hundreds of people moving stone and coordinating tasks. And only later, in the surrounding region, the spread of fully domesticated crops and permanent agricultural villages. It suggests something profound, that our ancestors may have started to reshape plants and animals, in part, to feed gatherings like this, to support feasts and rituals that brought scattered bands together on a scale never seen before. Religion, or at least shared symbolic life, might not be a byproduct of agriculture. It might be one of the reasons agriculture became irresistible. As centuries pass, the relationship between humans and certain plants deepens and changes. Wild wheat and barley stalks shatter easily when ripe, scattering seeds. Great for the plant, frustrating for the harvester. When people begin preferentially collecting stalks that hold on to their seeds a little longer, because they're easier to bundle and carry, they unwittingly select for non-shattering varieties. Those seeds get planted near camp. Their offspring inherit the tough seed heads. Slowly, the local population of grain evolves. It becomes less like its wild cousins and more like a human-dependent organism that waits to be cut. The same quiet domestication happens with pulses, lentils, peas, chickpeas, plants that fix nitrogen in the soil, fitting neatly into emerging crop cycles. On nearby hillsides, a parallel process begins with animals. Herds of wild sheep and goats have long been targets for hunters, but now, instead of taking only adults or the easiest kills, some groups begin capturing young animals alive, keeping them near camp for a while as a kind of living pantry. Over generations, they start managing which ones breed, culling the most aggressive males, keeping tamer individuals. Gradually, those hillsides sprout something new. Flocks. The once wild animals change under this pressure. Horn size, coat texture, body shape, breeding cycles. They all begin to shift. Like the grains, sheep and goats slide along the spectrum from wild to domesticated. Everything about this sounds like an upgrade. More predictable food, more people surviving bad years, villages growing and linking into networks of exchange. And yet, when you look at the bones, another story emerges. Skeletal remains from early farming communities in the Fertile Crescent show that the first farmers are, on average, shorter than the hunter-gatherers who came before them. Their teeth tell of more cavities and enamel defects, signs of high carbohydrate diets and childhood stress. Their bones show evidence of repetitive strain, spines compressed by constant bending, joints worn by grinding grain, hauling water, hoeing fields. Infections increase as more people and animals live in tight quarters amid their own waste. Nutritional diversity shrinks. Instead of dozens or hundreds of plant species, diets concentrate around a few staple grains and legumes, supplemented by whatever meat the herds can provide. The workday lengthens too. A mobile forager can often meet their needs in a few hours of focused effort, hunting, gathering, processing, then rest, socialize, tell stories. A farmer's tasks are endless and seasonal, breaking ground, sowing, weeding, watching for pests, irrigating, harvesting, threshing, winnowing, grinding, and always caring for animals, repairing structures, maintaining tools. From a strictly individual perspective, agriculture looks, at least at first, like a bad deal. So why did it spread? One answer is that it wasn't a rational choice made by a single visionary. It was a trap. Not a malicious one, but a structural one. Once a community adopts farming and its population begins to grow on the back of increased caloric yield, going back becomes almost impossible. A valley that supported a few hundred foragers with a varied diet can, under cultivation, support a few thousand farmers eating mostly grain. If the fields fail, famine looms. But if anyone suggests abandoning the fields and returning to a mobile lifestyle, there's a problem. There is no longer enough wild game and uncultivated plant food left in that same area to support everyone. Neighbouring regions are already occupied by other groups who have gone down the same path. You can't put the genie back in the bottle without a catastrophic die-off, and no one volunteers for that. Agriculture locks communities into higher population densities and narrower subsistence strategies. The benefits, more babies surviving, more people overall, accrue to the group over generations. The costs, harder work, worse health, are borne by individuals. From the point of view of cultural evolution, it's a winning strategy. From the point of view of a single farmer bent over in the sun, it may feel like a chain. And yet, this trap, once sprung, does not remain confined to the Fertile Crescent. In the valleys of the Yellow and Yangtze rivers in China, other groups of hunter-gatherers begin their own experiments. Instead of wheat and barley, their candidate plants are wild rice and millet, swampy lowlands, monsoon rains, river floods, a different ecological puzzle, solved with paddies and terraces rather than dry fields. Half a world away, in Mesoamerica, people slowly shape a wild grass with tiny, hard kernels into something we would recognize as maize. The process takes thousands of years. Early cobs are small and unassuming. Each generation of selection nudges them toward larger, more nutritious ears. Squash and beans join the party, forming a trio that will sustain civilizations. In the highlands of New Guinea, amid steep slopes and thick forests, communities begin to cultivate taro, bananas, and yams. Here too the pattern is similar. Climate stability after the Ice Age, population pressure in good niches, experiments with managing and planting favoured species, gradual entanglement with a handful of crops. None of these regions copy each other. They're too far apart for that, separated by oceans and thousands of miles of unfamiliar land. Instead, they rhyme. Wherever conditions align, post-Ice Age climate stability, rich assemblages of potentially domesticable plants, and populations dense enough to feel the squeeze, some human groups take the same path. Not in lockstep, not on exactly the same timetable, but with enough similarity that it suggests something about us. Given time and pressure, a species obsessed with pattern, memory, and control will eventually try to tame the yearly miracle of growth. Your ancestors did not think of it as an agricultural revolution. There were no manifestos, no declarations that from this year forward we shall be farmers. For them, it was a long series of small local decisions. Stay here another season, plant a few more seeds, keep a few more lambs, build one more storage pit, carve one more stone. But taken together, across the Fertile Crescent and then across the world, those decisions mark the hinge on which human history swings. For 250,000 years, your lineage had survived by moving through the world. Now, slowly, the world would begin to move around you. At first, it doesn't look like a revolution. It looks like staying put a little longer. Those semi-permanent camps in the Fertile Crescent, the ones with storage pits and grinding stones, start to leave deeper scars on the land. Post holes deepen into foundations. Hearths are rebuilt in the same spots year after year. Trash accumulates in thick layered middens. What began as a camp becomes a place. Seasonal rounds still happen. People go out to hunt gazelle, to gather nuts in the hills, to cut reeds along the river. But each year, more of the community stays behind to tend the fields, guard the grain, watch over the sheep and goats. Slowly, imperceptibly, mobility turns into attachment. Over centuries, these attached places grow. In the Jordan Valley, one of them becomes something truly new, Jericho. 10,000 years ago, Jericho is not yet a city by later standards, but it is enormous for its time. Hundreds of people, maybe more than 1,000, living together year-round. Mud brick houses clustered tightly, rebuilt over the ashes of earlier versions so many times that the whole settlement rises into an artificial mound. Archaeologists call such mounds tells. To the people who live on them, they're simply home. At Jericho, someone decides that home needs protection, or perhaps definition. Along one edge of the settlement, they raise a stone wall. Not just a low fence, but a substantial structure, several meters high, with a massive circular tower attached to it. The tower's base is filled with rubble. A staircase spirals up inside. Was it a fortification against enemies? A flood barrier? A communal monument? A ritual focus? No one knows for sure, but whatever its purpose, it marks a shift. Here is a group of humans investing enormous labour, not just in keeping themselves alive this season, but in reshaping their shared space for the long term. Far to the northwest, on a windswept plateau in central Anatolia, another experiment unfolds a little later. Çatalhöyük. 8,000 years ago, Çatalhöyük is one of the largest known settlements in the world, a dense agglomeration of mud brick houses packed so tightly that there are no streets at ground level. People move across flat rooftops, climbing down into their homes through smoke-blackened openings. Inside, life is intimate and layered. Floors are carefully plastered and replastered, smoothed to a shine. Walls are painted with scenes of animals, hunters, perhaps abstract symbols that meant more to them than they can to us. Bullhorns, real ones, are set into plastered benches. Niche-like platforms double as beds, workspaces, altars. Beneath those platforms the dead sleep. At Çatalhöyük and other early Neolithic villages, people often bury their relatives under house floors. Adults curled in fetal positions, children tucked between them. Sometimes, after a time, the skulls are removed, carefully cleaned and covered with plaster to recreate the face. Shells or stones pressed in as eyes. These plastered skulls are then displayed on shelves, in special alcoves, in communal spaces. It is as if the ancestors have not really left. They're integrated into the architecture, into the daily rhythm of life. You grind grain on the same floor that covers your grandmother. You sleep above your father. You look up from your work and see the stylized, staring faces of those who came before. Ancestor veneration, domestic ritual, memory made physical. Daily life in these villages revolves around a few key activities. In one corner of many houses there is evidence of grain storage, bins lined with plaster, pits sealed with clay. The success of the community depends on the careful management of these hoards. Keep them dry, keep them safe from pests, guard them from theft. Near the centre of the settlement or in shared courtyards stand large ovens and kilns, communal bread baking, communal pottery firing. The smell of smoke and roasting grain drifts over roofs and alleys. People gather, talk, share news while loaves bake or clay hardens. Outside, small fields and garden plots surround the settlement. Sheep and goats graze on nearby slopes. Herds must be watched, milked, shorn. Their manure collected and used to fertilize the soil or fuel the fires. Within this seemingly simple round of tasks, something new is emerging. Surplus. When the harvest is good, when flocks are healthy, there is more food than the community immediately needs. That surplus sits in storage bins and granaries like potential energy, and potential, in human societies, rarely stays neutral, because once there is surplus, there are choices to be made. Who controls it? Who decides when to open the bins, how to distribute the grain? Who gets how much in a lean year? These questions create space for new social roles. Some people become specialists in managing storage, keepers of the keys, guardians of the granaries. Others become particularly skilled at shaping clay, turning out pots with a grace and uniformity that speak of long practice. Others spin and weave, transforming plant fibers and animal hair into textiles more refined than anything a part-time craftsperson could manage. Surplus allows these people to spend more time on their specialties because they can rely, at least in part, on others to feed them. The community in turn comes to value their skills. Gradually roles harden into positions. The best potters, the most renowned weavers, the most persuasive ritual leaders, the lineages that traditionally oversee storage or animal sacrifice, they begin to accumulate not just respect, but advantage. Perhaps they receive slightly larger shares in redistributions. Perhaps their houses grow a little bigger, their walls a little more elaborately decorated. Perhaps their descendants, by custom, inherit certain responsibilities and the privileges that go with them. Property emerges first as a matter of habit. This field is the one your family has tended for as long as anyone remembers. Those sheep bear a distinctive mark on their ears. That house contains the bones of your ancestors under the floor. It can't simply be reassigned without disturbing the dead. Attachment to land, structures, and herds deepens. Once property is recognized, inheritance follows. If you've spent your life coaxing crops from a particular patch of soil, you want your children to benefit. If your lineage tends the village's central shrine, performs the key rituals, holds the stories of when to plant and when to harvest, you want that knowledge, and the status tied to it, to pass down your line. Rules begin to crystallize. Who inherits what, from whom, under what conditions. With inheritance, inequality can outlive any individual. A good year or a bad year matters, but the starting positions of families begin to diverge in ways that persist across generations. Human relationships change. For most of our deep past, social ties were thick webs of reciprocity. You shared meat because someday you would need meat. You watched someone's child because someday they would watch yours. Status existed, but resources were difficult to hoard. A hunted animal can only be eaten or it rots. Grain doesn't rot so quickly. Sheep give lambs year after year. Now, it becomes possible for one household to have significantly more stored food, more animals, more daughters and sons to work the fields than another. Marriages become, among other things, alliances between property-holding families. Bride wealth, dowry, and similar practices appear in different forms across regions, each tying together wealth, kinship, and obligation. Inequality is not yet an iron cage. Many early villages show relatively modest differences between houses, and some archaeologists argue for long periods of surprisingly egalitarian farming communities, but the toolkit for hierarchy is in place. Another shift is quieter, written not in walls and storage pits, but in worn bones and buried bodies, the changing roles of women and men. In many foraging societies studied in recent times, women contribute a large share of the food through gathering and small game hunting. Mobility, broad ecological knowledge, and social flexibility give them substantial autonomy. Childcare is woven into a life of movement. In early farming villages, work and risk concentrate differently. Fields must be weeded and watched. Grain must be processed through hours of grinding. Infants can no longer be easily carried long distances during seasonal moves because there are fewer such moves. Birth intervals may shorten as grain fuels higher fertility. Archaeological evidence hints at this shift. Skeletal remains thought to be female often show intense wear in joints, associated with kneeling and repetitive grinding motions. Burials classified as male, on average, show different patterns, sometimes more linked to herding, building, or conflict. Grave goods, too, begin to show subtle differences. Tools of weaving and food preparation more often with female burials, weapons or certain status items more often with male ones. It would be simplistic to say that agriculture invented patriarchy in a single stroke. Gender relations are complex, variable, and shaped by many factors. But a broad pattern emerges in many regions. As land, herds, and stored food become key sources of wealth, and as inheritance through male lines becomes more common, women's autonomy in some societies appears to narrow. Control over women's fertility, who they marry when they bear children, becomes tangled with control over property and lineage. While these internal dynamics are unfolding, villages are not isolated. They sit in landscapes webbed with trails and rivers, sending and receiving goods that come from far beyond the visible horizon. At Çatalhöyük, obsidian, volcanic glass, has been found in quantities far greater than local geology can explain. This glossy black stone, perfect for sharp blades and fine tools, comes from sources in the central Anatolian highlands and beyond. Yet artifacts made from that obsidian show up hundreds of miles away, in regions that have no volcanoes at all. Someone is carrying them, perhaps in small stepwise trades, one village to the next, or perhaps through long-distance journeys by specialist traders, moving obsidian one way, shells or pigments or cloth the other. Along with materials, ideas travel, a new way of decorating pots, a more efficient sickle design, a ritual practice involving plastered skulls, stories of distant places where people live differently, worship different powers, grow different crops. These early trade networks are not yet economies in the modern sense, but they are prototypes of something that will reshape the world, sustained interdependence between distant communities. Once again, a familiar pattern. What begins as a series of small local decisions, stay, plant, store, build, trade, ramifies into something larger. Villages become towns, surplus becomes power, property becomes lineage, gender roles shift, inequalities, once fleeting, begin to endure, and out of these dense humming landscapes of mud brick and memory, another threshold comes into view. Somewhere beyond Jericho's walls and Çatalhöyük's rooftops, the first true cities are waiting. If you walked into one of those early farming towns, it would already feel busy, complicated, full of obligations. But what appears next in the historical record is on another scale entirely. South of the older Levantine villages in the broad alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, the rivers do something peculiar. They flood unpredictably, carving new channels, abandoning old ones, laying down thick, fertile silt in a landscape with almost no stone and very little timber. For a long time, humans there live in small settlements, much like Jericho or Çatalhöyük. Mud brick houses, storage pits, shrines, fields of einkorn and barley. Then, around 3500 BCE, at a place we now call Uruk, the experiment of settled life takes a leap. Uruk is not just big for its time. It is unimaginably huge by the standards of every human society that came before. Tens of thousands of people, possibly more, clustered in and around a walled centre. Neighbourhoods of houses, districts for pottery, for metalworking, for textile production. Vast temple complexes rising above the plain, on stepped platforms of brick. If the Neolithic village was a camp that became a place, Uruk is a place that becomes a world. To live here is to be surrounded by strangers. Most people you meet during a day's work are not close kin. They are weavers, brewers, brickmakers, labourers, herders, temple staff, merchants sailing the river with boatloads of grain, wool, and fish. Managing such a concentration of people and resources is not something any previous human society has ever had to attempt. Fields must be irrigated and maintained, canals dug, dredged, repaired, labour mobilised for building projects, temple terraces, city walls, monumental gates, rations calculated for workers who may not directly farm the land they eat from. Surplus is no longer just a few bins of grain in a family courtyard. It is thousands of tons of barley moving through centralised storehouses, wool from immense flocks of sheep, fish and dates and reeds, all flowing into and out of institutional hands, temples, palaces, perhaps both at once. How do you keep track of it all? Early on in this region, people use clay tokens, small shaped objects, cones, spheres, discs, each representing a particular quantity of a particular commodity. 3 cones for 3 measures of grain, 2 spheres for 2 jars of oil. To record a transaction, you collect tokens that symbolize what is owed or delivered, and when necessary seal them together inside a clay envelope. The sealed ball, impressed with identifying marks, becomes a kind of portable contract. But as Uruk swells in size and complexity, tokens and envelopes become cumbersome. Too many objects, too many combinations. Someone, somewhere, has the idea. Instead of putting tokens inside the clay, why not press their shapes into the surface? Tokens flatten into signs. The envelope becomes a tablet. At first, these marks are simple, pictorial. A scratched ear of barley, the stylized head of an animal, numbers made with groups of incised wedges. They are tied tightly to accounting, list of rations, deliveries, allocations. Over time, the marks become more abstract. The pictograms rotate, simplify, fragment into standardized strokes made with a cut reed stylus, pressed into soft clay. This is cuneiform, wedge writing. It does not arrive as a sudden flash of inspiration. It condenses out of centuries of experimentation in counting, tallying, sealing, and marking. It grows because a city like Uruk, humming with workers and goods, needs it. But once it exists, it does something no human technology has ever done before. For the first time, information can be made external and durable in a systematic way. Not just in memory, not just in oral tradition, not just in pictures on walls whose meanings must be carried in living minds, but in signs that encode language itself. A scribe, trained from childhood to master the hundreds of signs and their combinations, can record more than deliveries of barley, debts, offerings, hymns to gods, lists of kings, contracts, laws, names. Knowledge no longer dies when the last person who remembers it stops breathing. You can write instructions for how to distribute grain next year. You can record an agreement about land that will only matter when the children of the current signatories are old. You can copy a story your grandparents heard from their grandparents, and your descendants can read it centuries later. Writing turns time into something you can stack, reference, re-enter at will. The first surviving tablets are full of what might seem boring, accounts, inventories, administrative minutiae. But behind their dryness lies a quiet revolution. Memory, which for hundreds of thousands of years lived in brains and bodies and stones and songs, gains a new home in clay. Uruk is not alone in this. Across the old world, in different river valleys, parallel experiments flicker into being. Along the Nile, as villages along the floodplain coalesce into larger kingdoms, officials begin marking goods and tombs with small symbols, proto-hieroglyphs. Some appear on ivory tags and pottery, others carved into stone. Like early cuneiform, these signs are bound to administration and status, recording names, counts, affiliations. Within a few centuries, Egyptian scribes are using a full writing system, hieroglyphic for monumental display, hieratic as a cursive script on papyrus, for religious texts, royal decrees and private letters. Far to the east in the Indus Valley, a different urban experiment unfolds. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa rise with planned streets, standardized bricks, complex drainage systems. On tiny steatite seals and pottery, short sequences of signs appear, what we call the Indus script. We still cannot read it. The texts are brief, the underlying language unknown. But the system has rules, repeated sign orders, consistent graphemes. It is, at minimum, a highly structured symbol set used to mark identity in goods. It may be full writing, it may be something in between. In northern China, along the Yellow River, early farming societies developed their own ritual and political hierarchies. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, under the Shang dynasty, we find a different kind of inscription, etched into turtle plastrons and ox scapula used for divination. Questions about harvests, warfare, royal births are carved into bone, heat-cracked, reed, and then sometimes annotated with the outcome. These oracle bone inscriptions are the earliest known form of Chinese writing, already sophisticated, already capable of recording speech. In each case, the path looks slightly different. Different materials, different aesthetic choices, different relationships between picture and sound. But the underlying pressure is similar. Once you have dense populations, stored surplus, institutions that outlive individuals, and decisions whose consequences stretch over decades, you need tools to stabilize information, to count, to categorize, to bind promises, to appeal to gods in specific, repeatable ways. Writing is one such tool. It does not replace spoken language or memory or ritual, but it weaves through them, altering how all three work. Meanwhile, the material infrastructure of these first cities demands and inspires its own cascades of innovation. In Mesopotamia and beyond, someone fits a solid disc of wood onto an axle and discovers that a laden cart can be moved more efficiently on land. The wheel, at first probably used for pottery and then for transport, changes the geometry of labour. In the same broad era, people begin alloying copper with tin to produce bronze. Harder, more durable, more workable than pure copper. This new metal flows into weapons, tools and ornaments, reinforcing both agricultural productivity and the power of those who control access to raw materials. Irrigation systems multiply. Canals stretch further from rivers into surrounding fields, linking villages and towns in watery grids that must be maintained collectively. Managing water means managing people, allocating rights, scheduling usage, mediating conflicts when floods or droughts disrupt the expected flow. Each innovation feeds the others. Better tools allow more land to be cultivated. More land yields more surplus. Surplus supports more specialists, metal workers, scribes, priests, administrators. Specialists devise new tools, new techniques, new rituals for holding societies together at scale. From the first experiments with planting wild grasses to the first true cities, perhaps 5,000 years pass. 5,000 years in which humans go from small kin-based villages with modest surplus to sprawling urban centres, with temples, palaces, writing systems, wheels, bronze, bureaucracy, and long-distance trade networks spanning hundreds, sometimes thousands, of kilometres. Set against the 245,000 years before, when our ancestors' tools and ways of life changed only slowly, this is a blur, a rapid, dizzying acceleration. A species that once survived by watching the seasons now begins to shape them, diverting rivers, terracing hillsides, planting and harvesting on schedules fixed by written calendars and recorded observation. The long silence of prehistory is over. From now on, in clay and stone and bone and ink, humans will leave a denser trail, and that trail will lead into something even stranger. Kingdoms and empires, laws and scriptures, philosophies that turn our new powers back on ourselves and ask what, if anything, we ought to be. We ought to. In southern Mesopotamia, the patchwork of city-states, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Kish, competes, cooperates, fights. Rulers rise and fall, irrigation networks expand, temples claim more land, more workers, more offerings. Sometime around 2300 BCE, a ruler from the city of Akkad Sargon does something unprecedented. Instead of just beating his neighbours and going home with loot, he keeps going. One by one he subdues the cities of Sumer, then pushes north and west into territories with different languages, different traditions. He builds garrisons, installs governors loyal to him, standardizes some measures and practices. For the first time in recorded history, a single political authority stretches from the Persian Gulf deep into northern Mesopotamia. We call it an empire. The Akkadian Empire does not last very long, perhaps a century or two in its full form, but it sets a pattern. You can take the city-state template, centralized authority, specialized bureaucracy, writing, organized religion, and scale it outward over many cities, many peoples. You can have a king of the four quarters, king of the universe, a person whose power is imagined to extend not just over one community, but over the very structure of the world. Along the Nile, something similar has already happened. By around 3000 BCE, small riverine polities in Upper and Lower Egypt have fused into a single kingdom. A pharaoh wears the double crown. Royal names and deeds appear in neat hieroglyphic cartouches. Massive stone tombs, the early pyramids, rise from the desert edge. Egypt is long and narrow, tied together by the predictable pulse of the Nile flood and by a shared script, shared gods, shared ritual calendar. For over 1,000 years, through ups and downs, this centralized state endures. It becomes a kind of political backbone running through North Africa. To the east, on the Levantine coast, smaller kingdoms, Byblos, Ugarit, later Phoenician cities, act as intermediaries in growing trade networks, shipping timber, metals and luxury goods between Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia and beyond. In Mesopotamia itself, the torch of empire passes. After Akkad collapses, other powers rise. Babylon under Hammurabi around 1750 BCE codifies laws in a famous stele, contracts, penalties, regulations carved in stone. The idea that law can be written, publicly displayed, and in theory applied consistently across a diverse population takes another step. Later, Assyria builds a military bureaucratic machine that reaches from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt. Assyrian kings deport entire populations, reshuffling peoples to reduce rebellion and increase control. They build roads, relay stations, archives. They carve reliefs showing captives, tribute, the king at war under the eye of the gods. What all these polities are doing in different ways is pushing the upper limit of human cooperation. They're taking people who will never meet each other, farmers in distant villages, traders in distant ports, scribes in palaces, soldiers on the frontier, and binding them into a single system of taxes, obligations, rituals, and expectations. They use force, of course, armies, fortresses, threats. But force alone will not sustain an empire across centuries. You also need stories, stories that explain why this king, this dynasty, this city has the right to rule. Stories that make it feel natural that grain should flow toward the center, that armies should march when summoned, that distant peoples should worship the conqueror's gods or at least acknowledge them. Religion, which for most of human history has been woven into local landscapes, this spring, this mountain, these ancestral graves, begins to stretch. Gods become more universal. A sky god or storm god of one region is equated with another elsewhere. Pantheons merge. Mythologies expand to accommodate new territories and peoples. In Egypt, the sun god Ra is joined with a moon to become a Moon-Ra, king of the gods. In Mesopotamia, Marduk of Babylon is elevated to a cosmic role when Babylon becomes politically dominant. In the Levant, small highland groups develop their own deity, YHWH, eventually imagined not just as a local storm god but as creator of heaven and earth. Meanwhile, written traditions thicken. Hymns, ritual instructions, royal annals, law codes, wisdom texts, early philosophical dialogues, they accumulate in temple libraries and palace archives. Scribes copy and recopy them, standardizing language, preserving older layers of thought alongside newer ones. As centuries pass, trade networks knit the old world more tightly. Tin from Central Asia or Anatolia feeds bronze industries in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan decorates tombs and temples. Spices and exotic woods travel from India and Arabia toward the Mediterranean. Ideas travel with them. Techniques for metallurgy, shipbuilding, bookkeeping, divination, tales of far-off gods and heroes. By around the first millennium BCE, a critical mass has been reached. Cities are larger and more numerous than ever. Literacy, while still limited, is no longer confined solely to priestly elites. Merchants and minor officials in many regions can read and write at least to some extent. Iron tools and weapons spread, reshaping economies and warfare. New states and empires, Neo-Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian, Persian, Zhou in China, Mahajanapadas in India, city-states in Greece, jostle and overlap. And then, across a vast arc from the Mediterranean to the Yellow River, something strange happens. Between about 800 and 200 BCE, a cluster of thinkers and movements appears that later historians will call the Axial Age. In eastern China during the late Zhou dynasty, constant warfare between rival states and the breakdown of older rituals create anxiety and opportunity. It is in this context that Kongzi, Confucius, teaches. He does not claim to bring new gods. Instead, he turns attention inward, toward human relationships and moral cultivation. He speaks of Ren, humanness, of Li, ritual propriety, of the importance of rulers who govern by virtue rather than fear. Around the same time in northern India, in a landscape of competing kingdoms and spiritual traditions, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, comes to his own unsettling conclusion, that life as ordinarily lived is pervaded by suffering, that craving is its root, and that there is a path to liberation through ethical conduct, meditation, and insight. He founds no empire. He leaves no written words. But his teachings, preserved by students, will spread along trade routes for millennia. Further west, in the Greek world, small argumentative city-states like Athens create a different kind of crucible. There, under the pressure of internal politics, colonization, and contact with older Near Eastern civilizations, thinkers begin to ask what the cosmos is made of, what justice is, whether virtue can be taught. Socrates wanders the streets of Athens, questioning craftsmen, politicians, youths, pushing them to examine their assumptions. His student Plato writes dialogues exploring the nature of truth, reality, and the good life. Aristotle systematizes logic, biology, ethics, politics, treating the world as something that can be analyzed, categorized, understood through observation and reason. In the highlands and small kingdoms wedged between larger empires in the Near East, Israel, Judah, later communities in exile, prophets arise who interpret political disaster as a moral and spiritual crisis. Amos, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and others speak of social justice, of caring for widows and orphans, of a covenant between a singular God and a people. They connect history, ethics, and theology in a way that will echo through Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. None of these movements exist in isolation. Persian imperial policy under the Achaemenids allows a remarkable degree of religious and cultural autonomy, facilitating contact and cross-pollination from Egypt and Anatolia to India. Royal roads and caravan routes carry caravans of merchants, soldiers, officials, and with them scrolls, stories, arguments, prayers. By the time Alexander of Macedon sweeps through the Near East in the late 4th century BCE, Greek philosophical traditions, Near Eastern religious ideas, and Egyptian thought begin to mingle in new Hellenistic cities. Why does this burst of reflection happen in roughly the same era, in such different places? No one can say with certainty, but some patterns stand out. Urbanization concentrates people and problems. In a small village, customs are often enough to manage life. In a city of tens of thousands, rules must become more abstract, more universal. Long-distance trade exposes individuals to alternative ways of living, worshipping, governing. Comparing cultures invites questions. Why do we do things this way? Could we do them differently? Writing and the early spread of literacy make it possible to preserve, critique, and build on previous ideas. A text can be argued with across generations. A law can be compared with another law. A story can be reinterpreted in light of new circumstances. States and empires, expanding and collapsing, force people to grapple with power, injustice, and change on a scale unknown to earlier ages. Under these conditions, religion and philosophy start to do double duty. They're no longer only about local rituals and seasonal cycles. They become frameworks for large, diverse societies to imagine themselves as moral communities. Confucianism offers a vision of hierarchical but reciprocal relationships, ruler and subject, parent and child, glued together by duty and compassion. It will become the backbone of Chinese imperial administration for 2,000 years. Buddhism and related Indian traditions offer paths of personal transformation that can be pursued regardless of caste or ethnicity, spreading from India into Central, East and Southeast Asia, adapting to many cultures while retaining a core emphasis on suffering and liberation. Greek philosophical schools, Stoics, Epicureans, Platonists, offer different answers to how to live well in an unpredictable world, influencing Roman law, Christian theology and modern ethics. The Hebrew prophetic tradition, eventually folded into the Hebrew Bible, places at its center a God concerned with justice, fidelity, and the behavior of individuals and nations, not just with sacrifices and rituals. This monotheistic thread will entwine with Greek and Roman thought to shape much of later Western and Islamic civilization. Alongside these ethical and metaphysical systems, something else is unfolding. In Babylon, skilled observers track the movements of planets and stars over centuries, recording them in cuneiform lists. They notice patterns, cycles, regularities. Their astronomy is tied to divination, but the data they accumulate will later feed into Greek and Islamic science. In Greece, thinkers like Thales, Anaximander, and later Aristotle proposed that natural phenomena can be explained without direct reference to divine whims. Through elements, causes, principles. Geometry becomes a formal discipline. Euclid proves theorems that will be taught in classrooms 2,000 years later. In India, mathematicians develop sophisticated notions of number, including early forms of zero and positional notation. They explore geometry, combinatorics, astronomy. In China, scholars compile systematic records of eclipses, comets, and planetary movements, while engineers refine technologies like the crossbow and iron casting. All of this, ethics, metaphysics, mathematics, astronomy, is part of a single, slow pivot. For the first time in our history, large numbers of humans are not only asking, how do we survive, or how do we serve the gods, but also, what is a good life? What is justice? What is the cosmos? And how does it work? The answers they give are diverse, sometimes contradictory. They argue with each other, revise, split into schools and sects. But the frameworks they build are durable. Modern legal systems, bureaucracies, educational traditions, religious institutions, and scientific methods all bear the imprint of these ancient debates. When you hear someone appeal to universal human rights, or speak of ethical obligations, or worry about the meaning of life, they are, whether they know it or not, drawing on questions articulated with new intensity 25 centuries ago. The acceleration that began with farming and cities turns out not to be only about tools, monuments, or empires of brick and stone. It is also an acceleration inside the mind, a deepening of reflection, a multiplication of stories about what the world is and what humans are for. From now on, History will not just be the story of changing landscapes and technologies, but of changing ideas about power, justice, the soul, the stars. And those ideas, written down, argued over, carried along trade routes and conquest, will set the stage for yet another phase of acceleration when a new kind of technology amplifies thought itself and begins to knit the entire planet into a single, restless conversation. By the late Middle Ages, that conversation is already global in outline. Caravans crawl across Central Asia, Chinese junks hug the coasts of the Indian Ocean, Arab navigators ride the monsoon winds, merchant republics like Venice and Genoa haggle in crowded harbours. Ideas, goods, plagues, and rumours move along the same routes. Libraries in Baghdad and Cairo preserve Greek philosophy and Indian mathematics. Monasteries in Europe copy and recopy Latin texts. In China, block printing and later movable type have existed for centuries, turning out Buddhist sutras and imperial edicts. The ingredients are there, but the mixture is still thick, slow, regional. Then, in the mid-1400s, in a corner of Europe that had once been a backwater of the Roman Empire, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg combined several existing technologies: movable metal type, oil-based ink, a screw press, and something clicks. Printed books have existed elsewhere, but this particular configuration, in this particular economic and cultural environment, behaves like dry tinder meeting a spark. The printing press is a second writing revolution. Clay tablets, papyrus scrolls, and hand-copied manuscripts made it possible to preserve knowledge across generations. But they were slow, expensive, fragile. A single manuscript might take months of labour. A library of a few hundred volumes could be the work of a lifetime. Gutenberg's press can produce hundreds of nearly identical pages in a day. Suddenly, the speed limit on ideas is no longer the speed of a scribe's hand. It is the speed of the press, the postal routes, the horse and wagon. For the first time, knowledge can spread faster than any single person can travel. A student in Paris can read the same text as a scholar in Florence, printed from the same plates. A pamphlet denouncing a king, a pope, a doctrine can appear simultaneously in dozens of towns. Errors can be spotted, corrected, reprinted. The effect is not instant. At first, many printed books are simply replicas of familiar texts, Bibles, classics, legal codes. But the underlying shift is profound. Ideas become copyable, reproducible, standardizable in a new way. When a strange monk named Martin Luther nails, or perhaps just sends, a list of theological complaints in 1517, printers seize on it. Within weeks, his theses are scattered across the German lands. Within months, they are being debated in cities he will never see. The Reformation is many things: theological, political, economic. But it is also a demonstration of what happens when stories and arguments can scale. Authority, once anchored in a few handwritten manuscripts guarded by institutions, begins to fragment, multiply, compete. Not long after, another kind of challenge emerges. In 1543, a Polish canon, Nicholas Copernicus, publishes a dense Latin work suggesting that the Earth goes around the Sun, not the other way around. The book is cautious, mathematical, abstract. It does not set Europe on fire, but it is printed. Copies travel. Astronomers read, critique, refine. A century later, Johannes Kepler and Galileo Galilei, armed with better data, better lenses, and the same printing technology, push the heliocentric model from hypothesis toward consensus. Around the same time, Francis Bacon and others argue for a new way of knowing: careful observation, systematic experiment, public reporting of results, not secret recipes held by craftsmen, but methods that anyone in principle can check. The scientific revolution is not a single event. It is a chain reaction. Observation leads to theory. Theory suggests new experiments. Experiments require better instruments. Better instruments reveal new phenomena. Each step generates more questions than it answers. And printing presses are there at every turn, multiplying data, spreading controversies, allowing anatomists in Padua to argue with astronomers in Prague, allowing a curious cloth merchant in Delft to show the world that there is an invisible universe of animalcules in a drop of water. By the 17th and 18th centuries, another wave of reflection rolls through Europe and its colonies. Thinkers start asking, if we can use reason and experiment to understand the motion of planets and falling bodies, can we also apply them to politics, economics, morals? The Enlightenment takes shape in salons, coffeehouses, pamphlets, encyclopedias. Philosophers like John Locke, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Rousseau argue about natural rights, social contracts, separation of powers, religious tolerance. They question divine right monarchy and inherited privilege. They appeal to a shared human capacity for reason, even as they are embedded in their own inequalities and blind spots. Again, printing is the amplifier. A pamphlet by an obscure writer can fuel a revolution. Thomas Paine's Common Sense sells tens of thousands of copies in the American colonies, an unheard-of number for the time. Encyclopedias attempt to gather all human knowledge between two covers, to be owned not just by kings and bishops, but by merchants, lawyers, doctors. Meanwhile, in damp workshops in Britain, something else is taking shape. For most of history, human energy budgets have been bounded by muscle, wood, wind, and water. A field can only feed so many. A village can only spin so much cloth by hand. A mine can only be drained by so many buckets. Coal has been burned for centuries, but mostly as a substitute for wood. In the 18th century, inventors begin to harness it in a new way. Steam engines, initially designed to pump water out of mines, become steadily more efficient. Someone realizes they can be attached to spinning frames, to looms, to locomotives. Now, for the first time, large-scale mechanical work can be detached from the rhythms of sun and muscle. The Industrial Revolution is a transformation of energy. Coal, and later oil and natural gas, are concentrated sunlight from ancient forests and plankton, compressed over hundreds of millions of years. Burning them releases that stored energy in a geological instant. Textiles, iron, railroads, steamships, telegraphs, factories, they follow one after another, each development resting on others, each increasing the amount of work that can be done per unit of human labour. The results are jarring. Cities swell with migrants from the countryside. Smokestacks rise where there were once hedgerows. Working hours stretch. Child labour, slums and pollution spread alongside cheaper goods and rising average incomes, and the population curve, which had been inching upward for millennia, begins to bend sharply. Around the year 1500, there may have been roughly 500 million humans on Earth, give or take, depending on how one reads fragmentary records and archaeological traces. By 1800, after the first waves of industrialization, the number is closer to 1 billion. By 1900, it is about 1.6 billion. By the year 2000, it is over 6 billion. Today, it's around 8. This explosion is not primarily because humans suddenly start having more children. It is because more of those children survive. Vaccination, antiseptic surgery, germ theory, clean water systems, synthetic fertilizers, mechanized agriculture, refrigeration, electricity. Each innovation nudges mortality down, food production up, carrying capacity higher. Behind almost every one of these advances lies the same pattern: observation, experimentation, publication, replication, science, then engineering, investment, mass production, industry, then dissemination through schools, newspapers, radio, television, mass culture. The feedback loop tightens. By the mid-20th century, after 2 world wars that demonstrate the terrifying destructive potential of industrial technology, a new layer is added. Electronic computing begins as a tool for code breaking, ballistics calculations, census tabulation. Room-sized machines with vacuum tubes and punch cards hum in government labs and corporate offices. Transistors shrink them. Integrated circuits shrink them further. Personal computers appear on desks, then in homes, then in pockets. The digital age is a third communication revolution. If writing let memories escape the brain, and printing let them multiply, digital networks let them flow, mutate, and recombine at a pace nothing in previous history can match. More information is now created, transmitted, and stored in a single day. Emails, posts, messages, sensor readings, financial transactions, satellite images, than in entire millennia of early human history. A person with a smartphone can access more text, more images, more data than the most powerful king of the Bronze Age. A scientist can share a new discovery with thousands of peers around the world in seconds. A rumor can topple markets. A video can cross languages and borders, altering what millions think and feel before breakfast. We're still in the early stages of understanding what this means. On one hand, the same human capacities selected in that ancient bottleneck, our gift for language, cooperation, storytelling, tool use, are being amplified beyond anything our ancestors could have imagined. On the other, we face new versions of very old problems: how to live together in dense societies, how to share resources on a finite planet, how to keep our tools from outrunning our wisdom. From the vantage point of the last few centuries, the curve of change looks like a hockey stick, flat for a long time, then suddenly shooting nearly vertical. Population, energy use, technological complexity, the rate of information flow, all surge. Look back, though, and the shape softens. The printing press builds on writing, which builds on speech. The scientific revolution builds on Babylonian star lists, Greek geometry, Islamic algebra, Indian numerals. The Industrial Revolution builds on thousands of years of tinkering with fire, metal, water wheels, and trade. The Digital Age builds on telegraphy, telephony, radio, and the long, slow refinement of logic and mathematics. What feels like everything at once is also the visible crest of a wave that has been gathering far offshore for a very long time. For 250,000 years or more, our ancestors chipped stones, told stories by firelight, watched the sky, experimented with plants, navigated rivers and coasts, refined kinship rules, and accumulated tiny local solutions to immediate problems. Most of those innovations left no monuments, no chronicles, no famous names. They vanished into the soil, into oral traditions, into the unrecorded background of everyday life. Were those ages silent? Only in the sense that our records of them are faint. The last 500 years are loud. Ink on paper, steam whistles, radio waves, the glow of screens. But they are not separate from what came before. They are the moment when a long invisible preparation crosses some threshold, and the feedback loops among knowledge, energy, and population begin to close so quickly that we can watch history change within a single lifetime. We, you and I, are living at the tip of that curve. We carry in our bodies the genes that survived an ancient bottleneck. We carry in our languages the echoes of hunter-gatherer metaphors, farmers' calendars, priestly chants, philosophers' questions, engineers' diagrams. We stand in a world where a thought can circle the planet in less than a second, where a discovery in one lab can alter the fate of billions, where our species has, for the first time, the power to see itself from orbit and to alter the climate of an entire planet. The long silence, it seems, was never really silence. It was a slow, patient murmuring, a background hum of trial and error, of stories and tools and rituals, building toward a moment when the volume would rise abruptly, and the human experiment would enter a phase where change outpaces memory. And even now, as the graphs spike upward and the future feels compressed, we are still, in another sense, at the beginning. A young species on an old world, just a few hundred years into discovering how quickly it can change, and still learning what to do with that discovery. So here we are, from perhaps 1,280 frightened primates huddled in scattered pockets of Africa, to 8 billion humans wrapping a web of light and radio around an entire planet, sending metal skeletons past the edge of the solar system, listening to whispers from the first galaxies. Same lineage, same fused chromosome, same hungry, curious brain. If you could take one of those bottleneck survivors, toughened by droughts and dust storms, expert in reading tracks and clouds and the subtle moods of fire, and show them our world, what would they see? Cities glowing like constellations turned upside down, great metal birds crossing oceans in hours, machines that can talk and draw and remember more than any living elder. Grains from wild grasses piled in mountains, enough to feed millions. Water running at the turn of a handle. Night chased away with the flick of a switch. They might be amazed. They might be horrified. They might squint past the noise and see something familiar, because under the satellites and skyscrapers and fibre optic cables, we're still doing very old things. We gather in groups. We share stories. We gossip and argue and fall in love. We worry about our children. We scan the horizon for danger. We dream about tomorrow. We still depend on the same thin layer of air, the same soils, the same cycle of rain and sunlight that sustained those small bands during the long crisis. If they could look at us, perhaps their real question would not be, "How did you build all this?" but, "What will you do with it? Will you use this power to make your world more stable, more generous, more forgiving? To leave room for other species that walk beside us for so long? To keep the climate within the narrow bounds that nurtured our whole history? Or will you turn your tools against yourselves and let the curve that rose so steeply bend back down? We cannot know. What we can say is that the story is not finished. We stand inside a chapter that future humans, if there are future humans, will look back on as we look back on the bottleneck, the first fire circles, the first scratched symbols. They may see this as the time when we learned to live within planetary limits, or the time when we failed. For now, you and I are just brief voices in that long conversation. You, listening wherever you are, in a city apartment, a farmhouse, a dorm room, a ship's cabin. Me, a pattern of words and data, carrying echoes of very old questions into a very new medium. If you'd like to keep travelling through this deep past and strange present, you can gently tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe. If you feel like sharing, tell us where in the world you're listening from. A modern map of descendants of those ancient survivors, scattered once again, but connected now by light instead of footpaths. And if this journey through prehistory has stirred your curiosity, there's more waiting for you. At sleepytimehistory.com, you'll find a book about prehistoric secrets, an expanded, quieter dive into the worlds before writing, perfect for late-night reading as you drift towards sleep. For tonight, though, you've reached the end of this path. From the embers of the first campfires to the glow of the screen beside your bed, from a handful of survivors to a world of billions, you are part of an unbroken line. Let that thought sit with you for a moment. You are here because, again and again, someone made it through the winter. Someone remembered the path to water. Someone shared food and shelter and stories. Their story continues in you. May your night be peaceful. May your rest be deep. And when you wake, may you carry, somewhere in the back of your mind, the quiet knowledge that you are a chapter in something vast and very old and still unfolding.